Well, greetings to everyone. As always, I hope this finds you well. If you have a Bible with you today and you haven't grabbed it, I invite you to go ahead and do so and join me today in Psalm number 127. We are continuing on here in our series of looking at the Psalms of Ascent, these psalms that were sung on the way to Jerusalem as they went to celebrate the three great festivals during the year: the festival of Pentecost, the festival of Passover, and the festival of the tabernacles or booths. In today's psalm, we are going to have a song that reflects a little bit on the blessings of children and the blessings of family. Now, a person could rightfully ask as they were looking at this, why, as they were on the way to Jerusalem, would they want to sing a song about family? But I'll remind you, as they were on their way to worship in Jerusalem, this was not just an individual affair. Many times they were traveling with their families to go and do this. It was a communal experience. And so it is only right that as they made their way to Jerusalem, they would sing a song about the blessings of their children and the blessings of family. And as we read this psalm here today, this will give us an opportunity to reflect on the blessings of family in our own life. So I hope you have your Bible open now to Psalm number 127. Let me take a moment here to read it for you, and then we'll spend some time reflecting on it. Unless the Lord builds the house, its builders labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchmen stand guard in vain. In vain you rise early and stay up late, toiling for food to eat, for he grants sleep to those he loves. Sons are a heritage from the Lord, children a reward from him. Like arrows in the hands of a warrior are sons born in one's youth. Blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them. They will not be put to shame when they contend with their enemies in the gate. I mentioned last Sunday that Olya and I were celebrating 17 years of marriage together. Anytime our anniversary comes around, it's a natural time to reflect on what the years have brought to the two of us. And we didn't really do much special for our anniversary this year. We didn't go out to dinner. We didn't exchange any presents. This year, we didn't even give cards to one another. And this is not because we don't love one another, but it's just kind of because life is busy and hectic at the moment. Olya started a new position in her job, and that's been stressful for her. I've been somewhat consumed with thinking about all the things that are going on in our broader society and how to lead the church in the midst of that. And of course, we have three boys who are at home with us and have been home with us now for several months, being out of school. We're very fortunate that we have Valentina at home with us to help with that. But even with that, ours is a very busy household. Speaking of boys, that is one of the things that we can't help but reflect on as we celebrate 17 years of marriage together. I remember when Andrew was first born, people at church back in Sladen were telling us how fast that the years were going to go by. And we believed them at the time, knowing them to be the kind of people who would not just say such things if it wasn't true. But of course, we had no frame of reference to put with it. When Andrew was born, we had only been married for 4 years. We could not fathom just how quickly the years would start stacking up. But they do. 17 years has passed, and now not only do we have 2 little boys in our home, but a teenager as well. Another one of the things that people told us about, but that we could not adequately grasp at the time, is how insufficient we would often feel as parents. You know, whenever we were in college and we were watching other people raise their children, we had all these ideas about what we were going to do when we finally got the chance to raise children. I was going to read all the classics to my boys. Olya was going to make sure none of them had sugar until they were like, 35 maybe. We were going to train them to be spiritually strong young people. And, of course, almost everything went out the window immediately. One of the things that people did not tell us is that more often than not, um, there would not be clarity about what you should do as a parent. For example, seen some parents who were very strict with their children, and all their children turned out to be very rebellious. I've seen others who were very relaxed in their discipline with their children, and they too turned out to be scoundrels. On the other hand, I've seen some parents who were pretty strict and very disciplined, and they raised beautiful children who loved the Lord. And once again, I've seen some who have taken a more relaxed attitude, and their children too also matured into wonderful people. There is so much that you simply cannot control in the course of life, including your own energy and skill levels to do all the things that you think need to be done. And so, more often than not, I simply find myself praying for mercy as a parent. Have mercy upon me, O God. Have mercy on me as I try to show my children the way. Have mercy on me, O God, and help me not to mess them up royally. All of this came to mind this week, not only in the light of our 17th anniversary, but also as I read the opening words here of Psalm number 127. Unless the Lord builds the house, its builders labor in vain. You may have noticed that as we were reading the psalm, the heading of the psalm not only recognizes that this is one of the Psalms of Ascent, but interestingly enough, in this instance, this psalm is attributed to Solomon. Now, we are quite used to the idea that many of the psalms are attributed to David, but not so much Solomon. Now, the Proverbs, yes, we attribute almost all of the Proverbs to Solomon. But normally, we don't think about the Psalms as being his particular domain. Now, we don't know for sure that Solomon wrote this psalm. Again, these ascriptions are only tradition. They're not a part of the inspired text. But it's not too hard to see why the Israelites might have assumed that this was written by Solomon. Prominent among the themes of this psalm is the idea of God building a house. Perhaps I don't need to remind many of you that Solomon was the one chosen by God to build his house. Do you remember that story? I won't have you turn there, but I will have you try to recall the story from 2 Samuel chapter 7. In that chapter, we have the story of David's desire to build a house for God. For years, David has been at war trying to conquer all of Israel so that he could unite the kingdom under his own reign. And he finally accomplishes that. And after he does, he conquers the city of Jerusalem in order to set up that city as the new capital of his monarchy. Once that job was done, and David had built a beautiful palace for himself, a thought occurred to him. Here I am living inside of this beautiful palace fit for a king like myself. But the Ark of the Covenant, the very representation of God's presence on earth, it is still existing in a tent. It was okay for the ark to reside in a tent so long as the people of Israel were still somewhat mobile in the land. But now that they have established themselves and have built for themselves a wonderful capital, could it be that they are going to leave a home for God in a tent? I think we all have to recognize this is a very good impulse from David. Perhaps we could even say he's a little bit behind the eight ball on this one. Maybe if his heart was really where it was supposed to be, in the right place, building a house for God would have been the first thing that he thought of, rather than building a palace for himself. But let's not be too critical of David. God doesn't seem to be offended, so let's not be offended on his behalf. But do you remember what God said to David when David revealed his plans to his prophet Nathan? God responded through the mouth of that same prophet Nathan. And he said to me, or excuse me, he said to David, "Are you the one to build a house for me? After all of these years, have I ever asked anyone to build me a house?" And the answer, of course, is no, he hasn't. It was by his own choice that he dwelled among Israel in tents. No, God says to David, I am going to build a house for you. I'm going to build a dynasty for you, so that when you lay your head down and rest with your fathers, I will establish the throne of your kingdom through your son, and your son will build a house for me. Isn't that interesting? Now, later on, God will tell David why he is going to allow him to do this. Why he's not going to allow him to do this. David was a man of war. And while war may have been a necessary part of what David needed to do in his particular circumstances, a man of war is not going to build God's house of worship. They don't really go together, you see. And as much as God's people have tried to make them go together over the years, they don't go together. But, God says, your son will be a man of peace. He will build my house. Though in truth, it will be me building his house. Okay, with all of that in mind, listen again to the opening words of Psalm 127. Unless the Lord builds the house, the builders labor in vain. Do you see now why Israelite tradition came to attribute this particular psalm to Solomon? Solomon built a house for the Lord. But it is also true that God established Solomon's house. So you see how it would be natural, or how natural it would have been for Solomon to have said, unless the Lord builds the house, the builders labor in vain. But this double dynamic, that we build the house of God, but that God also builds the house, is the perfect dynamic for understanding this psalm as we take it and think about it in terms of our own families. In one sense, it is true with our families, we are building the house. It is our family, and we are laboring to build it under God. But in another very real sense, it is God's house. In other words, if He did not provide the abundance of provision, we could labor all we want, but our labor would be in vain. Solomon uses two other examples in this psalm in verses 1 and 2 to show how this is a reality in our life, and if we read them carefully enough, he also shows us a couple of temptations that we will face in our own family-raising years. First, he says in the second half of verse 1, "Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stands guard in vain." Here we are kind of experiencing something that's a little bit outside of our cultural experience. So we have to use our imagination to understand what it is that he means. But most of us have seen enough movies or have read enough books about ancient times that we can actually picture this pretty quickly. In the ancient days, in order to remain protected, walls were built around cities. Outside the walls were the wildlands. Anything could happen outside the walls. Thieves and murderers and all kinds of dangers existed out in the wide open. But so long as you were behind the city walls, well, you were relatively safe. I say relatively because nowhere in life are we completely secure, and neither were the city walls. Sometimes an army could come upon your city, and even if they didn't have the power to crest your walls and to come into your city, they might have the power to cut you off so that everyone inside of the city starves to death. So, what did the ancient cities do to hedge themselves against threats like this? They placed watchmen on the walls. There were these towers that were built into the walls so the watchmen could look out for threats that might be coming from a great distance. But here is the point that the psalmist is making. Unless God is watching out for your city, the watchmen are watching in vain. You can take all the precautions that you want. But if God is not aiding you, you're doomed. And that strikes me as a valuable insight for those of us who are raising children. A temptation for many of us might be to put our children behind walls. Now, the family unit itself can be like a wall, and it is a rightful place of protection for our little ones, just as the ancient cities were very right to build their own walls to protect themselves from those on the outside. This is a dangerous world, and it continues to be dangerous as we labor under the curse. But sometimes we guard those walls as if it all depends upon us. Forget the fact that while we have our responsibilities in the matter and should not neglect them, ultimately, these are God's children, more than they're even our own children. And if they're not safe in God's hands, they're certainly no safer in ours. So, reasonable provision for our children? Yes, absolutely. But frantic overprotection? No. That's the first image. The second image comes in verse 2. In vain you rise early and stay up late, toiling for food to eat. For he grants sleep to those he loves. Now, we might rightfully pause here and ask, what does this statement have to do in a psalm about the family? Why this emphasis about getting up early and staying up late? It is with these words that we could learn that perhaps the ancient world is really not so different from us. You know, I occasionally hear it bemoaned today that we are more busy than ever before, that we're running here and there and we're working long hours and we don't have time for some of the things of life that are important, and that this is a completely new and unique aspect of modern life. Well, I suppose it is true that modern life has some unique demands. I don't suppose ancient people had to try to get 3 different boys to 3 different baseball games, okay? But here, this psalm lets us know that really, there's nothing new under the sun. Here is the picture in verse 2 of someone who is so obsessed with how he or she is going to provide for their family, to make more money. They stay up late, they get up early, and they're always thinking, how can I make a little bit more? But the verse then ends with this reminder: God grants sleep to those he loves. What is he saying to us with this? Well, just as sometimes we can overfocus on protecting our children, so also can we also overfocus on providing for our family, thinking that we need more and more for life and experience in our family. And listen, there is some truth to this, and you can't just dismiss it out of hand. If there were not a legitimate side to this, many of us would not get so caught up in it. But the psalmist asks us to remember this: God knows your needs, And He does not expect us to be driven people as if everything rests upon our own shoulders. Yes, do what is yours to do, but then let God worry about the rest. He knows your needs. As Jesus once said, "Look at the flowers of the field. They neither toil or spin, and yet God dresses them in ways that are more beautiful than even Solomon himself, the one who may have written this very psalm." And then Jesus says, "Do not worry about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink or what you will wear." Why? Because your heavenly Father knows that you need these things. But if you will seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, all the rest will be taken care of. That's another way of saying He gives sleep to those that He loves. So, there are many challenges for those of us who are raising families today. But the challenges are really not that much different from those who have gone before us. Yes, some of the specifics may be different, but the challenge itself is not different. The same temptations are there today that have always been there. All these things are easy to talk about, but they're hard to live into. Hard for me and hard for you. But make no mistake about it, church, this is what we are aiming at. And as it was then, so it is now. This psalm proclaims to us that children are a heritage from the Lord. It's true we may not always know what we're doing as parents, but the responsibility that God has given us is a blessed responsibility. And all I ask for us to remember this week is that just like Solomon, we are not building this house all on our own. Unless the Lord builds the house, we all labor in vain. God bless you, and have a good week.